In Obstacles to the Truth Part 1, we outlined the cognition, language, perspective triad. In Part 2, we'll cover the obstacles themselves. Be sure to watch Part 1 before watching Part 2. Between cognition, language, and perspective, there are a number of obstacles that can prevent a person from arriving at the truth. We're going to start with perspective and work our way back around to language. When we examine something and aren't certain of our perspective, we have to interpret. We have to estimate all possibilities and configurations of the data at hand while also keeping track of what we do know and don't know. This is an active mental exercise. Let's take a look at our 3D icon, a line drawing of a cube. Are we looking at the cube this way or this way? This visually demonstrates the primary obstacle to the truth we face related to perspective: misinterpretation. When all we can see are the lines, there really is no way for us to know exactly what we're looking at without getting some additional information or context. This cube is a visual analogy for all misinterpretations of perspective along all axes. We can misinterpret our perspective when we fail to accurately recognize what one or more pieces of information does and does not mean. When we think that a piece of information confirms X, but it actually doesn't. When we think that a piece of the puzzle fits in a certain place, but it actually doesn't. This is misevaluation of information. At the 4D level, we can fail to recognize all possibilities and configurations along the axis of time, or fail to recognize the true sequence of events. This includes failing to recognize the true origin of a piece of information and the order in which things are true. As an example, Bill finds a piece of information on an internet message board and repeats it to Todd. Todd doesn't think that the information is true and challenges the idea. Really, neither Bill nor Todd know if the information is true or not, but Bill is only suggesting that it's hypothetically possible that it's true from an unknowing perspective. Todd presses Bill for supporting evidence, and when Bill doesn't provide any, Todd takes this as an indication that he is correct. The information Bill got from the internet message board is baseless. Therefore, the information can be treated as false and dismissed. This is a 4D error, or an out-of-sequence judgment by Todd, because Bill is not the source of the information. He's just relaying the information. The true source of the information is the person who posted it on the internet message board. If the information is true, it was already true before it was posted online, which was before Bill even saw it, which was before he relayed it to Todd, which was before Todd tried to challenge it. If the information is untrue, once again, it was untrue from the beginning, before Bill saw it. So the fact that Bill could not provide supporting evidence to Todd has no bearing on whether or not it's true. The conversation after the fact between Bill and Todd does not determine anything but itself. First, the truth is. Then, the truth is known. At the 5D level, we can fail to recognize all possibilities and configurations along the axis of cognition. One example is the way Todd thought that Bill believed the information he relayed from the internet when Bill was merely open to the possibility that it was true. Another example is the difference between a person telling a lie versus saying something that they believe to be true but being mistaken, or a person doing something on purpose versus doing it by accident. A strong understanding of cognition and the mind in general is needed to interpret the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of other people. Last but not least is the failure to recognize your own cognitive bias. Combine all of these things together and you may recognize how trying to figure out the truth is like trying to solve a multi-dimensional puzzle. As social creatures, human beings have what's called a herd instinct. Before the dawn of civilization, people were dependent on the herd for survival, so being separated from the herd significantly decreased your chances of survival. This instinct still lives in the human mind and manifests itself in different ways. In terms of thoughts and beliefs, people generally don't want to accept or harbor ideas that are not accepted by the herd out of a latent fear of being exiled. In the simplest terms, if a majority of the herd, or even people within our own social circles, consider an idea or a belief to be wrong, or weird, or crazy, many of us will be disinclined to accept it. Or, if we do accept it, we may feel like we shouldn't admit it. This can be considered a cognitive bias. A person's worldview is a foundational part of their understanding of life itself. A person's worldview gives them a sense of the context in which they exist. Because our worldview is such a foundational part of our understanding, it's difficult for the mind to have its worldview challenged. Sometimes a contradiction to a person's worldview can cause so much cognitive dissonance that it's interpreted as threatening on a subconscious level. As a result, worldview is highly susceptible to confirmation bias. The mind is inclined to confirm its existing worldview, not to change it. The path of least resistance is one that avoids challenges. In many ways, the human brain and mind can be likened to a muscle. For example, the ability to handle certain kinds of mental tension, like cognitive dissonance, or uncertainty, or self-control, can be strengthened over time with practice. By default, the mind has an urge to arrive at conclusions. The ability to resist this urge and suspend judgment requires a certain kind of mental strength, or discipline. However, since the development of this strength is not really necessary to get through daily life, many people don't ever develop it. This leaves people handicapped when it comes to processing several pieces of nuanced and contrary information about complex subjects in order to arrive at the truth. In the modern world, people want fast food truth, quick and easy, not nuanced and challenging. This leaves them highly vulnerable to deception and misinterpretations of perspective. The fundamental attribution error is something that arises when we evaluate behavior, whether it's our own or someone else's. The simplest way to think of it is as a matter of the way the person is versus the circumstances the person is in. When we're evaluating the behavior of other people, we tend to attribute more to the way that the person is than to the circumstances that they are in. And when we evaluate our own behavior, we do the exact opposite. That bias is the error. To borrow from the spectrum of corruption, failure to understand the fundamental attribution error can lead you to falsely identify someone as a psychopath, a person with no regard for others who is committing crimes for personal gain, when you're actually looking at someone who is being extorted, participating in crimes because they have been threatened. This is just one type of example. Since language is the primary form of communication for human beings, it's considered a means of conveyance, or in other words, a way of transmitting something to a person's mind from the outside. Other means of conveyance are any and all forms of media. Bear in mind, the word media is the plural form of the word medium. Everything from ancient cave paintings to handwritten notes to modern audio and video is media. Just as human beings use language to verbally transmit messages to each other, human beings package data into various forms of media to convey it to other human beings. Through these means of conveyance, a person's cognition and perspective, which are internal, can be manipulated from the outside. The deliberate use of the means of conveyance to influence or manipulate human minds can be called propaganda. There are many different deceptive techniques of propaganda, but we'll just cover a few. Deceptive framing uses language to target perspective. Through the careful selection of words and careful structuring of statements, a false perspective can be encoded into a statement. Deceptive framing is generally used to mislead instead of telling an outright lie. For example, a certain word or phrase can be chosen because of its connotation, while the greater statement is not technically false. The connotation can guide a person's interpretation of the subject matter. Another example of deceptive framing is implied causality, where the implication is made that one thing caused another without explicitly saying so. This is something accomplished using time-related words. For example, imagine this as a news headline. Company goes bankrupt after X. The use of the word after gives the impression that the company went bankrupt because of X, but doesn't technically say that. Let's take it to an extreme. Man dies after eating new chicken sandwich from burger joint. The man ate the sandwich and got hit by a car an hour later. The headline is true, but misleading. Appealing to emotion is quite simply trying to take advantage of the influence that emotion has over cognition, or tugging on the heartstrings. Appeals to emotion usually try to place emotional significance or emotional factors above all else as if they should be the sole basis of judgment. As social creatures, human beings have a sense of social hierarchy, or pecking order. Appealing to status is generally making the implication that information, or an assertion, or an idea hold extra weight because of who they are coming from, or who they are supported by, and are therefore more likely to be true. An appeal to authority is essentially the same as an appeal to status because people or entities with authority are considered high status. If the king says one thing while the peasant says another, the king is probably correct because he's the king. Fear is a powerful motivator. To suggest or imply that something should be accepted as the truth and entertained because not doing so may come with negative consequences would be an appeal to fear. Better safe than sorry. The simplest form of propaganda is media manipulation, which can include deceptive editing, selective coverage, and outright fabrication, among other techniques, to imply or assert a false version of reality so that people will believe it. When we don't witness or experience something ourselves and we are relying on information from outside sources, we use our imagination to reconstruct the situation in our heads hypothetically. It's an intuitive mental process. We then make our observations, form our judgments, opinions, etc., based on this reconstruction in our heads. But it's very easy for us to overlook something crucial. Does the hypothetical reconstruction in our heads actually match up with reality? If it doesn't, then our judgments, opinions, and whatever else that are based on it don't apply to the real world. Remember, the conclusion to any equation is dependent on the values that are plugged into it. If false values are plugged in, a false conclusion will come out, even when the calculation is perfect. Modeling is an open, ongoing process where the objective is to make your reconstruction, or model, as accurate as possible, rather than to arrive at a conclusion. The desired result is a true five-dimensional replica of the situation in question. It requires constantly revising and editing the model as you gather and evaluate new information, as well as reviewing the work you've already done to see if you've made any mistakes or neglected to consider other possibilities. As you build the model, you start to develop a more complete picture. As you can imagine, this practice requires the suspension of judgment, especially because a perfect model can sometimes be very difficult or even impossible to create. With modeling, the approach is open by default. Judgment is suspended by default. By contrast, many people who don't suspend judgment try to directly calculate their way to the truth, which leaves them vulnerable to the obstacles. This direct calculation is often largely symbolic because it's based on a hypothetical reconstruction that hasn't been properly evaluated for accuracy, using a lot of us instead of thes. It's often based on an assumption that we already have enough information to figure out the truth. The primary difference is that this way of approaching the truth is driven by the urge to make a judgment or a determination, while modeling is predicated on suspending judgment. The calculator wants the work to be done as quickly as possible, while the modeler approaches the work like it may never be done. The calculator says that the truth is 5 because 2 plus 3 equals 5, while the modeler says that x may not equal 2 in the first place. The calculator wants to have an answer, while the modeler wants to maintain discipline. As an example, let's look at the parable of the blind men and the elephant. Each man touches a different part of the elephant and thus describes the elephant differently, with each man insisting that he is correct while the others are wrong. Because they're blind, they don't recognize that they are each examining a different part of the same animal. If you were one of these blind men, to take a modeling approach would mean making an effort to figure out if there's any way that more than one description of the elephant can be true at the same time. It would mean taking all descriptions of the elephant into consideration and trying to reconcile them with each other in an ongoing effort to develop a complete picture of the elephant. By contrast, to simply calculate would be to dismiss the descriptions provided by the other men because they differ from your own. I know the elephant firsthand, and your description is inconsistent with my knowledge. Therefore, you must be wrong. As you can imagine, the benefit of modeling is that it can strengthen our sense of perspective and our ability to hold mental tension, helping us avoid the obstacles to the truth. So, how should this understanding be implemented? Learn to recognize actual and potential cognitive bias in yourself and in others while training yourself to handle cognitive dissonance and suspend judgment. Learn to understand language as math or algebra. Learn to break statements and pieces of information down into their core components to ascertain what they do and do not mean. Learn to recognize deceptive propaganda techniques to prevent yourself from falling for them and to identify dishonesty in other people. Strengthen your sense of perspective by learning to model instead of just calculating. This concludes Obstacles to the Truth, Part 2. Let's examine the parable of the blind men feeling up the elephant. What?
Nothing. Just leave.